helping a team go from 30 to 60 in 4 months, making sure everybody understands their roles. You've got to create a lot of channels that bring in good people. What is the story that we're telling, right? If you're spending too much time convincing somebody to make the commitment to join you, you got to ask yourself why. Speed is critical. The best companies I've seen do this are making killer hires in 5 days. I want you to know exactly why you want to be here. In my experience, a team of 4 or 5 should be capable of getting you from 20 people to 200.
Hello, Chris. How's it going?
Hello, Chris. How you doing?
Kind of starting off, I don't really think there's many people more qualified to advise early stage companies and how to scale and grow teams. You've been at companies like Wealthfront and witnessed dramatic scale there. You've exited a company at Fleetsmith, and now you're at Unusual Ventures, assisting portfolio companies on how to build and grow teams. I know your role is pretty unique, so I guess can we start by you going through a bit about what you do in your current role?
Yeah, sure. Awesome. Well, I definitely joke that since I started in tech, I've sort of kind of been downsizing ever since beginning. So I kind of wound up at Google early and in my career, and that was really cool to be around sort of the best of technical recruiting structure. But I learned in a matter of months that I couldn't get excited recruiting for large teams where I couldn't see how the hires were making a direct impact. And so, as you alluded to, I think Google led to a variety of other roles in recruiting, go-to-market, technical recruiting. But at Unusual, as a talent partner, and we're an early stage VC firm, we primarily invest at the seed stage or A stage more opportunistically. Most talent partners really are tasked with looking after the whole portfolio. It's a lot of advisory conversations, introductions. It's a really interesting role. But what attracted me to Unusual, and actually I didn't want to work at a VC, what was that we take a very specific approach in working with our founders in a deep, kind of narrow way, such that we can help them execute in, say, recruiting, and then move on to another team who needs us. So, across the 20 or 25 core investments that we'll make in our third fund, and that will take us about 2.5 years, every quarter, I work with 2 founding teams, usually the ones who are on the cusp of hypergrowth, kind of on the spurt to get to an A or post A. And, I become head of talent. A lot of times it feels more like I'm working, at a Contra or a Lucky and not at Unusual Ventures. And the idea is if I can be focused for 4 months and help bring on head of sales or some founding engineers, that's an up-leveling that will accelerate their timeline to the next funding round. And my peers at Unusual Ventures are all operators. So, there are go-to-market partners who do what I do on the sales side. There are marketing partners. Our whole mission is to actually put the muscle into helping our founders build.
That must be incredibly interesting because you get to experience all those different companies and challenges and the intricacies of what's happening in each of them.
Yeah.
I guess do you ever get kind of super attached to one of them and you're like, oh no, I have to go? There's that emotional element.
Totally. I hope there are some that are watching this and thinking, I wish we hadn't lost Chris. I think that was maybe one of the more jarring elements where, in some ways it does feel sort of consultancy in that way. When you invest so heavily in, helping a team go from 30 to 60 in 4 months, those are real deep connections. But it's not goodbye forever, right? I'll come on and support maybe an executive search and work with their search firm in ways. We are a very focused investment firm. And so we're not trying to keep track of hundreds of investments. We're really in touch with our core investments that are making their way. But it is hard. It is a challenging part of the role. Yeah.
I can imagine. I know that you're a huge advocate of holistic hiring, and many people might be like, well, what's holistic hiring?
What is that?
So in your own words, could you maybe explain how that how you use that when you're advising these businesses.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think caveat this by saying that, my expertise is in early stage startup hiring. And so, I think that there really are fundamental differences between big tech and early stage. And so if you're listening to this and you're, running at roles for a big tech company, I guess stick a pin in this. And hopefully the learnings will still be there. I think that what happens for a lot of teams that are growing is that, quite honestly, recruiting is a function that is sort of put to the side, and not, there is not a thoughtful approach around how to hire early enough in a company's life cycle. A company might be 50 or 60 or 70 people, and they've found a way to cobble together good hires. But by that point, they still haven't created a recruiting engine where you understand the inputs required to get to a certain output. And so, I would say that for me, holistic hiring is at the highest level. It's the act of making sure your whole team, like founder, hiring manager, interviewers, are fully on board for the really hard task of hiring people at a company that doesn't have a big brand yet, right? And that is still growing. So holistic hiring is not making one-off hires, right? Oh, we got to find this engineer. Let's create a process from scratch and spin it up and close it down. Or, oh, it's an executive hire we have to make. Let's go single out, take all this time to find an executive search firm. It's really early on making sure everybody understands their roles such that hiring can kind of be ongoing and you can start and stop quickly, because time to hire is the most critical thing for a growing company, and not encounter a lot of thrash as you're sort of getting going. So that's how I would encapsulate holistic hiring.
As you mentioned, a lot of founders and people who are growing businesses, they start by maybe using their own networks, friends, and it seems relatively straightforward in the beginning, but then it hits a point where it becomes a lot more difficult. And
yeah,
when would you advise a founder to start, or founders to start thinking about holistic hiring? When do you start thinking, okay, now is the time that we set these responsibilities, where we have frameworks?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think it's hard to say a specific number, but I think when you're, let's say you're post-seed round, you're hitting 10 or 12 people, you're making your way to an A round. That's a really good time where the team is yet to balloon, to put in place some really core practices that I think everybody can sort of internalize. I think one of the really big challenges that happens for early stage teams is kind of like you referenced, they will over-index on one recruiting channel, right? They might overly index on everybody who's here, bring us your people, right? Or maybe they're tapped into a couple of agencies, which can be a big help, but that's incredibly expensive. Or maybe they are kind of hacking their way through outbound. I think one of the realizations that early stage founders need to understand is that early stage hiring is not about selling and convincing somebody to join your team. If you're spending too much time convincing somebody to make the commitment to join you, you got to ask yourself why, right? There's probably a blocker, and it's a big risk that they will then go on to the next opportunity, right? Whether it's for more cash or something like that. Early stage hiring is about always looking for those candidates who aren't only technically adept, but are running at your company because they believe in the mission, maybe they admire the team, or there's a technical challenge that is core to what they want to do. And then you spot them and you get them through the process. It doesn't matter if they were referral, if they were inbound, if you source them, you create all of these channels, and then you are hyper in tune with where are the good people. And when you see them, you use momentum to your advantage and you get them through. And I think if you create a practice of opening up your audience, not only is it most inclusive, I mean, if you're relying on referrals, right? You're referring people who look like you, right? And I think, great companies that scale, it's fine for in the early days, 25 or 30% of the company to be referrals, but you got to create a lot of channels that bring in good people. And it's never too, it's never too soon to start doing that.
Talentful provides flexible recruiting solutions to the world's most ambitious companies. Are you thinking about ways to add flexibility to your talent function? With recent market volatility and hiring set to return to growth mode in the near future, there's never been a better time to choose the right partner to help you scale. Talentful's embedded sourcing, recruiting, coordination, and talent advisory services have been trusted by the world's leading brands. Companies such as Atlassian, Microsoft, Expedia, Pinterest, Waymo, and more. Whether you're hiring across engineering, go-to-market, or G&A, Talentful has got you covered. To find out how Talentful can help you, visit talentful.com. Absolutely. And so let's imagine, a company in the kind of golden zone of running up to this Series A point. They're starting to think about holistic hiring. Maybe they've done hiring through their networks before and they're looking to open up their channels.
Sure.
Like you said before, a lot of these companies just don't have a brand. No one knows who they are. They're in a massive competitive sector where everyone's vying for attention and eyeballs. Sure. What can a company do? Like, they're starting on this journey to look at that brand piece and that storytelling piece. What are some things they can do?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question. I think the reason I like early stage hiring isn't because I'm obsessed with technical hiring or go-to-market hiring. I'm not your best recruiter in any of those functions. I'm a generalist, and I get excited by understanding the value proposition of exceptional companies and then making sense of that story to candidates. And so, it's as simple as when you're starting to hire at more volume, you should be having kickoff meetings for every search that not only touch on like what we're looking for in the search and what your role is as an interview, but also crystallizing what is the story that we're telling, right? How do we speak about funding? What is our mission statement? That needs to be the same story from everybody, or it starts to fall flat. So it starts internal. Again, it's not about necessarily pushing your story out as far as you can, right? Early tech companies don't lean into marketing spend without product market fit. They become evangelists internally, and then in the channels where they live, they begin to create excitement by telling that story. So I think that's one, right? Like, why is this a special place to work? I think, I would say kind of beyond that, it's really important to think about how you, like the tactical steps you make to start building every channel. My opinion on posting your jobs as a startup has changed dramatically in the last few months. I used to think that if you were a startup at the seed stage with a brand that wasn't developed yet, it was sort of worthless to post a role online where it's a candidate's market and where people are flocking to big brand names. Not the case at all. I mean, I'll post a role at stealth posting that speaks to the quality of the founders and the momentum, and you're getting really interesting inbound activity. And so, especially in this market, which is an employer's market, and folks should be leaning back into hiring when they're ready, you should begin to nurture an inbound pipeline. I also would always encourage teams to build relationships with one or two strong external recruiting partners. Talentful, right, is a perfect example. The mistake that founders make is having relationships, but very, very weak ones with 8 different talent agencies or firms. And, they're not going to lean into helping you hire if you're not leaning into the relationship. And so these folks you're working with, they want to see 3 or 4 or 5 roles to run at, not a one-off posting that you might sort of look at resumes that come in. So pick your partners, they'll get to know how you work, and you'll start to find success there as well. And I think third, you do need to establish a rhythm of going outbound and getting your company in front of, in many cases, a lot of the best candidates are employed, right? And so you need to start the process of getting your name out there. The amount of hires I get to make where I'll reach out to somebody great who's not looking, but has a best friend who is, it's kind of that early generation of excitement. And I think if you tap into those three pieces, independent of if it's an eng need or a design need or a sales need, you're going to start to see some success with getting a good pipeline going.
Awesome. Well, it's so interesting because, we're on kind of the first stage of what a company might think about, and to some people, maybe it seems obvious, but there are so many companies that just don't even have these things in place, even many more established businesses. And I think that if people knew how much of an advantage it gives you having these things, and you could somehow relate that back to performance over time or revenue or, because they're all very related.
Yeah.
I think you'd see a lot more companies get these things sorted immediately.
Yes, let's get more data on that. Like I totally agree. Yeah. I mean, it takes me to, right, like if you're thinking about just the extension of hiring, right, it's never too early to understand what is your philosophy on compensation as a company, right? Are you aiming to pay, and this goes right in hand with what are the channels you've created? How are you bringing people in? Are you aiming to pay top of market on equity or middle market on cash? If you don't address this early and don't treat everybody the same within their various benchmarks, which of course are different depending on role, even if you're 20 people, you're going to wake up to a day where everybody is making, completely different amounts. Some have strong ownership, others don't. And you're spinning your wheels, kind of like reversing a lot of the inequity you put in place unintentionally. And so it's just, and that's part of this hiring. You want to think thoughtfully about how you're bringing people in. And that of course extends, to things like compensation. So we could spend an hour on comp.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a rabbit hole. One of the things that I think, companies typically get quite a bad reputation for is the experience once they've attracted the talent. When they bring them in, they're assessing them. These are incredibly, I guess, stressful times for people. They get really excited about roles. Maybe they're unemployed. They spend a lot of time going through assessments and different tasks. What are some of the key things, in your opinion, that can make a company stand out in terms of the actual execution of bringing people in, like you said, convincing them this is an incredible team, incredible proposition, and putting pen to paper and signing the offer?
Sure. Well, I think this is perhaps the topic within the realm of recruiting that I'm most passionate about, because I think there's a massive opportunity for startups who are smaller and scrappier and just more personal in their nature to execute on a ridiculously cool and fast interviewing process. Big companies try to do this, but it is impossible. It is impossible for large companies to run as fast as startups at getting somebody through the process. And so part of getting everybody on board for the task of early stage hiring is making sure folks understand that speed is critical, right? If you have a great interview on Monday and the person is a strong, we love this person, the next conversation should be on a Tuesday and the one after that on a Wednesday. The best companies I've seen do this are making killer hires in 5 days. You have to realize that if you're showing the candidate how well run and how much of a priority hiring is for you, that indicates to them that you've got your blank together, right? Like, what you're doing internally. Furthermore, you're always looking for candidates who, I like to say, the ones that should come on board and the ones you ultimately want to hire, they are becoming more excited with every step of the process, right? It's your job to always be educating, informing. They sell themselves, right? If it's not the fit, fine, you realize that. But if it is, and you're kind of bringing them along, they will sell themselves. And it's a good test. If you're moving somebody through in a week and they start to pull away or not get back to you to schedule interviews, stop and sort of assess why. Like, what are the blockers there that aren't uncovered that will, can ultimately lead to us making an offer and it not being accepted? Time is at a premium for startups. And so pipeline doesn't really matter. What matters is, are you spending time with the candidates who will ultimately convert, which means they're a technical fit, and you're always assessing, assuming we make you a good offer, are you ready to do this? Like, do you want to be here? And so, I think for recruiters who are listening, it's so important also to just be that check-in perspective, right? Be that person who's hopping on a call before a final round. I love to kind of create, I'm the friend, I'm kind of the guide, bounce anything off me. It's the hiring manager's job to talk about career leveling and the technical fit. But you got to be attentive, because that's something that's really hard for big companies to do. So there's a lot of ways you can differentiate, I think, at the early stage. But I think those are a couple, and speed is just so important. Anytime.
I know this is slightly off topic, but relevant is, what do you think of this concept of like the anti-sales pitch in an interview process?
Oh, sure.
I know there's a few founders that I know that have, if there's a senior hire coming in, they'll have a meeting where they try and convince the person basically not to join.
Yeah.
What do you think of that concept just generally?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really interesting concept. I think it's certainly one that I've used or have seen others really love to use. I think it's less about, I don't see it as so much anti-selling, but rather, throughout the interviewing process, just consistently setting expectations and not kind of over glamorizing what a startup will be. I think a lot of startups are glamorous, and the stories you hear are the glamorous stories. And so I think, look, it's not for people who've been in startups for a long time, they've got a sense, of course, but there are many who really want to be at a startup, but haven't quite internalized that this will mean taking on whatever task needs to be done, whether it's so beneath you, you can't believe it. And so for me, it's more about just making sure somebody is really ready, for the grind, and ready to commit to that, because you don't want surprises when somebody joins in what they're expected to accomplish, right?
Absolutely. And I'm sure you've seen this a lot, and there's been I've seen quite a lot of posts on this recently, but the concept of, I certainly have worked with founders and even investors to some degree that really glamorize big name logos for incoming candidates, right? They must have worked at Google, they must have worked at X or Y. And a lot of the time, those people might not, and actually probably a higher probability, aren't right for your small startup. So how should founders maybe think about the type of talent? Should they care about the logos, and how do you avoid getting caught up in that game? Is it about setting that process and making sure you got that nailed?
Well, I think that great startup candidates can come from Google, and they can also come straight out of undergrad and become, a principal engineer who is a 10x multiplier for you in 3 years. What I'm looking for when I'm meeting candidates, and this is a bit of a lens, I guess, into my just initial conversations, wherever you're coming from, like, are you somebody who, when you look back on your career trajectory to date, are you able to make sense of the career transitions you've made and why you made them? I want startup candidates to join who totally know why this is the place for them. It's such a common pitfall for really bright candidates to kind of give I love to do anything, I'll take on anything. I want to learn, and that's great. But I want you to know exactly why you want to be here, because that gives me faith that when things are hard, and they will get hard, like, you are in this for the right reasons. So look, I mean, it's definitely not true that you need to have worked at startups to be at a startup. And it's certainly not true that the best startup candidates, are steeped in the startup world. I just think you should be paying attention to the motivations of a candidate. What are the factors that matter to you in your job search? Questions like that.
Yeah, and I guess it goes back to what you were saying at the beginning. If you have a real clear understanding of who you are as a company, your values, the actions you want in candidates, right. And have a clear view of the roles that you're hiring, have those intake meetings, those kickoff meetings. Yep. That allows you to filter out who is right and who is wrong. And I think that a lot of companies miss that step out, and so they're kind of finding out as they go, rather than really setting the tone from the start. That makes total sense.
Yeah. Have questions that test for resilience, right? Or grit.
Yeah.
You can't see those things on a resume necessarily, right? So you need to dig into it. Yeah, totally agree.
One of the things that's, I think companies, especially early stage, have started doing a lot more is bringing in, a talent specialism into their business. Obviously you're doing it 2 companies at a quarter at a time. But when should a company start thinking about that, in your opinion? What should they think about when they're bringing on building a talent function? How should they be thinking that from a strategy point of view?
Yeah, well, it's a really critical hire. And I think, I'm not going to say that it's something you should do too early in your life cycle as a company, but I think one way to look at it is, if you're finding that you as founders or you as hiring managers are just spending too much time kind of keeping things moving, it's definitely time to bring somebody in whose main goal is to be attentive to the channels, attentive to the pipeline, and make sure that everybody else on the team is only spending time with the people they should be spending time with. So part of this is just, it is a support function. And I think the best recruiters build a good top of funnel, but then really only bring the best people through. And you will hit a point where you need somebody to organize that. Look, I think just to put some numbers around it, I think regardless of stage of funding, I think if you're about to hire in a higher volume cadence and one that you expect to maintain in the future, I think when you're 25, 30 people, that's a really good time to solidify an excellent head of talent. If you go too early, I think there is a risk that you might not be able to attract the experience you're looking for, because great lead recruiters or heads of talent are excited by scale, right? And they're going to be excited to look at the foundation and the story that exists and then build a recruiting program around that. So I think that's a good starting point for that first hire. And I'm a big advocate for quite early building out, your initial recruiting team. And it's actually one that can be quite small, that can take you a long ways. But I think if you have a team of 3 or 4, head of talent, maybe a recruiter who's very technically focused, maybe somebody early in your career who does half sourcing, some go-to-market recruiting, and a coordinator, then, when it's most important to learn, right, in this run up to scale, that team of 4 is learning their roles, right? They're meeting the hiring managers, like they're building the relationships that will help recruiting work. And, maybe add in another recruiter, but in my experience, a team of 4 or 5 should be capable of getting you from 20 people to 200, right? Or beyond, as long as everybody understands their role and you're building, like I've mentioned, all the different pieces required to build an engine, right? And not just say, oh my God, there's a role I have to run after. So that's how I think about kind of early internal recruiting. And you start the process then of, maybe not entirely, right? I think you should always have a couple of strong external partners, but you can bring more things in-house, right? And you're starting to tell a very authentic story.
That first, recruiting hire that you made,
Sure.
Would that be someone who's kind of execution focused? I know that a lot of mistakes that people make is going for this big head of talent, necessarily, first of all, who hasn't been hands-on for a decade.
Sure.
And
Sure.
definitely in those early stages, you have to be, in the mix and hands on.
Sure.
Would you get someone that's like a really competent kind of lead recruiter who can take that step up and wants to take a step up? Would you start with just a mid-level recruiter to do some hiring and then bring in a head of talent? Like, how should people think about that?
I mean, I've seen those both scenarios be really effective. I think I'm always somebody who, for any role, prioritizes aptitude and slope and ambition, right? No matter the role, I am looking to hire somebody who will be a VP one day if that's what they want. That they're always looking for something new. And so, I think the challenge with bringing in somebody very experienced too early is that they might have carved out, probably because they're really great at it, a specific niche in design hiring, right? Or technical hiring. And in the early going, I mean, you are hiring for anything and everything, and you need to be somebody who is okay with that. Like, this reminds me of a head of sales search that I just helped one of our teams with, where, we started thinking, God, like, we would love somebody who's done this before, right? Has done this a few times. We ended up bringing in somebody exceptional, but this is a leap. And I think because of that, there's a chip on the shoulder, and you really want to prove. And so, look, there can be great motivations for somebody to get back into that after having a longer career or different experience. But I think somebody who isn't yet ready to lead a team of, lead recruiting for a company of 200, but can grow into that if they're a top performer, I think is perfect.
Yeah, unfortunately, not everyone has a Chris on their hand.
Oh my gosh. Well, the amount of talent on the market right now is exceptional. So it is an amazing time, I think, if you are in this stage, go out and lock in that hire, because it's there's a lot of good folks.
Absolutely. Well, Chris, I think that this is incredibly valuable content for anyone that's listening, and I'm sure people will just execute on this stuff. They'll save themselves a ton of time in the future. So I really appreciate your time. Take care.
Awesome. My pleasure. Good to see you.